Good evening and welcome back to Bedtime History. Tonight we're embarking on one of the most extraordinary journeys through time that history has to offer. We're going to explore the complete story of the Viking Age, from its mysterious beginnings in the fjords of Scandinavia to its thunderous end across oceans and continents. When you hear the word Viking, what comes to mind? Perhaps you picture horned helmets and massive ships cutting through icy waters. Maybe you think of fierce warriors with braided beards or tales of pillaging and conquest. But what if I told you that almost everything you think you know about the Vikings is only a small piece of a much larger, more complex, and absolutely fascinating story? The Viking Age wasn't just about raids and battles. It was about explorers who reached America 500 years before Columbus. It was about traders who carried silver from the Middle East to the frozen North. It was about poets and storytellers, craftsmen and farmers, mothers and daughters whose lives were woven into one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Over the next hour, we'll uncover the real story of the Vikings. We'll walk with them through their longhouses on winter nights when the aurora danced overhead. We'll sail with them across unknown seas to lands that existed only in dreams. We'll stand beside them in the great halls of kings and in the humble workshops of blacksmiths whose hammers shaped not just iron but the very course of European history. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or simply curious about these legendary seafarers, I'm glad you're here with me tonight. Now let's begin our journey back to a time when the world was wider, wilder, and full of possibilities that called to those brave enough to answer. The story of the Vikings begins not with a single moment, but with a slow awakening. Picture Scandinavia in the late 8th century. The land is harsh and beautiful, carved by glaciers into deep fjords that slice inland like the fingers of some ancient god. Forests of pine and birch stretch endlessly across rolling hills, broken only by rivers that rush toward the sea with the urgency of melted snow. In this landscape, scattered communities of people have learned to live with winter's grip and summer's brief, brilliant gift. They are farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and traders. They worship gods whose names echo with thunder and whose stories speak of courage in the face of an uncertain world. They are not yet Vikings. That word, that identity, that legend is still waiting to be born. But something is stirring in these northern lands. The population is growing. Young men look beyond their fathers' fields and see opportunity calling from across the water. Shipbuilders are perfecting designs that will change the course of history. And in the workshops of skilled metal workers, new weapons are taking shape, forged with techniques that blend artistry with deadly purpose. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For generations, the people of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had been sailors. The sea was their highway, connecting communities separated by mountains and forests. They had long boats for fishing and shorter vessels for coastal trade. But sometime in the 7th and 8th centuries, something remarkable happened. Their shipwrights began to create vessels unlike anything the world had ever seen. These new ships were miracles of engineering and art combined. Long and narrow, with shallow drafts that let them navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, they could be rowed by 30 or 40 men when the wind failed, or sail swiftly when favorable breezes filled their single square sail. Most remarkably, they were designed to be carried overland when necessary. A crew could beach their ship, shoulder it, and march across land to launch it again in another body of water. The ships had names that spoke to their builders' pride and poetry. Dragon ships, serpent ships, wave steeds, sea kings. Each was a work of art, its prow carved with the head of a fierce animal, its sides painted with shields that caught the light like scales. When these vessels appeared on the horizon, they looked like mythical creatures rising from the depths. But ships alone don't make Vikings. The transformation required something else, something that historians still debate and puzzle over. Why did peaceful farmers and fishermen suddenly become the most feared raiders in Europe? What changed in their world that sent them sailing beyond familiar waters to distant shores? Part of the answer lies in politics. The 8th century was a time of consolidation in Scandinavia. Powerful kings were emerging, uniting smaller territories under their rule. This created both opportunity and pressure. Young men who might have inherited land found themselves with fewer options. Ambitious leaders needed wealth to reward their followers and maintain their power. The old ways of life were shifting, and some chose to seek their fortunes beyond the horizon. Another factor was contact with the wider world. Scandinavian traders had long journeyed south, bringing amber and furs to exchange for silver and exotic goods. These journeys brought back more than material wealth. They brought stories. Tales of monasteries filled with gold and silver, of kingdoms rich beyond imagination, of lands where armed resistance might be lighter than expected. The religious landscape was changing too. Christianity was spreading slowly northward, challenging the old gods and old ways. Some embraced the new faith, while others clung more fiercely to their ancestral beliefs. This tension created its own kind of energy, a need to prove that the old ways still held power. Climate may have played a role as well. The medieval warm period was beginning, making sea travel easier and more predictable. Longer growing seasons supported larger populations, while improved weather made ambitious voyages more feasible. All these factors came together like ingredients in a blacksmith's forge. The heat was rising, the metal was ready, and skilled hands were prepared to shape something new. The spark that ignited the Viking Age came on a summer day in the year 793, on a small island off the northeast coast of England. Lindisfarne was home to one of the most important monasteries in the British Isles. Founded by Irish monks in the 7th century, it had become a center of learning and spirituality. The monastery's library contained precious manuscripts. Its church held golden chalices and silver crosses, and its reputation for holiness drew pilgrims from across Europe. The monks of Lindisfarne lived peaceful lives dedicated to prayer, study, and service. They rose before dawn for morning prayers, spent their days copying manuscripts and tending gardens, and gathered again in the evening to sing psalms as the sun set over the North Sea. They had little reason to fear attack. Who would dare assault a house of God? On that fateful day in June, the answer came from the sea. Sails appeared on the horizon, low and swift. The ships that approached bore carved dragon heads and crews unlike any the monks had ever seen. Tall men with long hair and beards, armed with axes and spears, speaking a language that sounded like wind and storm. What happened next shocked the medieval world. The raiders attacked without hesitation or mercy. They killed monks who tried to resist, captured others to sell as slaves, and looted everything of value they could find. Sacred books were scattered, holy vessels were melted down or carried away, and the peace of centuries was shattered in a single day. But the raiders did something else that proved even more significant in the long run. They demonstrated that even the most protected places could be reached and conquered. The sea, which had always been seen as a barrier, became a highway for those bold enough to master it. News of the Lindisfarne raid spread across Europe like wildfire. The scholar Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne, captured the horror and disbelief. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. But while Christian Europe recoiled in horror, something else was happening in the northern lands. The raiders had returned home wealthy, famous, and eager to share their success. The ships that had carried 30 or 40 men to Lindisfarne inspired the building of dozens more. Young men who had never considered leaving their farms began to dream of distant shores and glittering treasure. The Viking Age had begun. Over the following decades, the pattern established at Lindisfarne was repeated across Britain, Ireland, and the coasts of continental Europe. Each spring, as soon as the seas became navigable, dragon ships appeared on the horizon. Monasteries, trading posts, and coastal settlements learned to fear the sight of those distinctive sails. But even as the reputation of Viking raiders grew, the full scope of their activities was becoming apparent. These weren't simply pirates looking for quick plunder. They were explorers, traders, and settlers whose impact would reshape the medieval world. In Ireland, they founded cities that still stand today. Dublin, Cork, and Waterford began as Viking trading posts. In England, they conquered entire kingdoms and established settlements that became thriving communities. In France, they sailed up rivers to attack Paris itself and eventually established the Duchy of Normandy. Their reach extended far beyond the familiar waters of Western Europe. Viking ships crossed the treacherous North Atlantic to reach Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America. They sailed down Russian rivers to reach Constantinople and the riches of the Byzantine Empire. They traded with merchants in the Middle East and may have traveled as far as Central Asia. Each of these journeys required not just courage, but remarkable skill in navigation, shipbuilding, and survival. The Vikings developed techniques for finding their way across open ocean using the sun, stars, and natural phenomena. They learned to read weather patterns and ocean currents. They created a culture that celebrated exploration and rewarded those brave enough to venture into the unknown. But who were these people really? What was daily life like in a Viking community? How did they see themselves and their place in the world? To understand the Viking Age, we need to look beyond the raids and battles to see the society that produced such remarkable seafarers. The word Viking itself gives us a clue. It comes from the Old Norse Vikinger, which probably meant someone who went on expeditions, particularly by sea. But this was an activity, not an identity. The people we call Vikings called themselves Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, or more specifically, they identified with their local communities and leaders. A typical Scandinavian settlement of this period would have been built around agriculture and craft production. Families lived in long, narrow houses with curved walls and turf roofs. These buildings were designed to withstand harsh winters, with thick walls and central hearths that provided warmth and light during the long, dark months. The social structure was complex but relatively flexible compared to other medieval societies. At the top were jarls, powerful nobles who controlled large territories and commanded the loyalty of many followers. Below them were carls, free farmers and craftsmen who owned their own land and had the right to bear arms and participate in legal assemblies. At the bottom were thralls, slaves who had been captured in raids or born into bondage. But this hierarchy wasn't rigid. A successful warrior or trader could rise in status and wealth. A poor farmer's son might join a raiding expedition and return rich enough to buy land and start his own household. The Viking Age was, in many ways, a time of social mobility and opportunity for those willing to take risks. The stories that have come down to us speak of a culture that valued courage, honor, and loyalty above almost everything else. The highest aspiration for a warrior was to die gloriously in battle and earn a place in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where the god Odin gathered the bravest warriors to fight alongside the gods in the final battle at the end of the world. But Vikings weren't just warriors. They were also poets and storytellers, craftsmen and merchants, farmers and explorers. Their culture produced some of the finest metalwork and wood carving of the medieval period. Their poets created complex verses that are still admired today. Their merchants established trade networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, and it was this combination of skills and attitudes that made the Viking expansion possible. They had the technology to build superior ships, the social organization to mount large expeditions, the economic incentives to seek wealth abroad, and the cultural values that made dangerous journeys seem glorious rather than terrifying. As we continue our journey through the Viking Age, we'll see how this remarkable culture evolved and spread, how it adapted to new environments and challenges, and how it ultimately transformed both itself and the world it encountered. The story that began with a single raid on a small island monastery would eventually span continents and centuries, leaving a legacy that still echoes in our world today. The years following Lindisfarne saw the Viking world expand like ripples across a vast pond. What had begun as isolated raids soon evolved into something far more systematic and ambitious. By the early 9th century, entire fleets were setting sail each spring, not just from Norway and Denmark, but from settlements that the Vikings themselves had established along conquered coastlines. These weren't random attacks anymore. They were carefully planned campaigns led by experienced commanders who had learned to read the political landscape as skillfully as they read wind and tide. They knew when kingdoms were weak, when harvests had failed, when civil wars had divided potential enemies. They struck with the precision of master craftsmen and the patience of experienced hunters. The transformation of Viking society during these decades was remarkable. What had once been primarily agricultural communities began to reorganize around the wealth and opportunities that came from overseas expeditions. Shipyards expanded along every suitable coastline. Blacksmiths found themselves working not just to supply local needs, but to arm expeditions that might number in the hundreds or even thousands of warriors. The social fabric began to change as well. Success in raiding brought not just material wealth, but social advancement. A farmer's son who distinguished himself in battle might return home to find himself invited to sit at the high table in the Jarl's hall. A craftsman whose weapons proved superior in combat might find his services in demand across multiple kingdoms. Women whose husbands or sons prospered in these ventures gained influence and resources that would have been impossible in the old agricultural economy. But perhaps the most significant change was in how these northern peoples began to see the world itself. The sea, which had always been important to coastal communities, now became a highway to limitless possibility. Young people grew up hearing stories not just of local heroes and familiar places, but of distant lands filled with wonders and opportunities. The horizon, once a boundary, became an invitation. This shift in perspective was reflected in their language and poetry. The old verses had celebrated the changing seasons, the loyalty of retainers, the wisdom of elders. The new songs spoke of storm crossing and treasure winning, of strange shores and exotic peoples. They developed an entire vocabulary for describing different types of expeditions, different kinds of ships, different strategies for different kinds of targets. The gods themselves seemed to reflect this changing worldview. Odin, the All-Father, was not just a god of wisdom and magic, but a wanderer who traveled between worlds seeking knowledge. Thor's hammer protected not just the local community, but all of Midgard from the giants who threatened order. Freya welcomed not just local warriors to her hall, but the bravest from all lands and peoples. Religious practice began to incorporate new elements as well. Weapons captured in distant battles were offered at sacred springs. Ships were blessed not just for fishing and coastal trading, but for voyages to unknown waters. The runes that had once been used primarily for local record-keeping began to appear on memorial stones that celebrated expeditions to Ireland, England, and lands even more distant. The economic impact of this expansion was profound. Silver flowed into Scandinavia from across the known world. English coins, Islamic dirhams, Byzantine solidi, and Frankish deniers all found their way into northern treasure hoards. This wasn't just wealth for its own sake. Silver could be melted down and fashioned into arm rings that served as both ornament and currency. It could be used to commission fine weapons and jewelry that demonstrated status and success. It could buy land, livestock, and loyalty. But the Vikings weren't content to simply take what they found. They quickly recognized that sustained wealth required more than raiding. They needed to establish trading relationships, create permanent bases, and develop new sources of revenue. This realization led to one of the most significant developments of the early Viking Age: the establishment of permanent settlements in conquered territories. Ireland provided the first laboratory for this new approach. After decades of seasonal raids, Viking leaders began to establish fortified bases along the Irish coast. These weren't just military outposts. They were trading centers where goods from Scandinavia could be exchanged for Irish products, and where Irish goods could be prepared for export to other Viking settlements. Dublin, founded around 841, became the model for this new kind of Viking settlement. Built at the confluence of the River Liffey and a smaller stream called the Poddle, it occupied a strategic position that controlled access to the Irish interior while maintaining easy contact with the sea. The Vikings who settled there weren't just warriors. They included merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and their families. The settlement grew rapidly, attracting not just Scandinavians but Irish people who saw opportunities in this new commercial center. Intermarriage became common, creating a hybrid culture that was neither purely Viking nor purely Irish. Children grew up speaking both languages, worshipping both sets of gods, and inheriting traditions from both sides of their ancestry. Similar developments were taking place across the Irish Sea in England. Here, the Vikings encountered a more complex political situation. England in the 9th century was divided among several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each with its own king, laws, and military traditions. But these divisions, which might have made conquest more difficult, actually provided opportunities for clever Viking leaders. The strategy that emerged was both simple and sophisticated. Rather than attempting to conquer all of England at once, Viking armies learned to exploit conflicts between English kingdoms. They would ally with one king against his enemies, accepting payment and land grants in return for military service. When that relationship soured or became unprofitable, they would shift their allegiance to a different kingdom, often bringing valuable intelligence about their former allies' weaknesses. This approach required a level of political sophistication that contradicts the common image of Vikings as simple raiders. The leaders of these expeditions needed to understand complex diplomatic relationships, assess the military capabilities of potential enemies and allies, and navigate the intricate protocols of royal courts. They needed to be diplomats and spies as well as warriors. The most successful of these leaders began to establish their own kingdoms on English soil. The great army which arrived in 865 was unlike any Viking force that had come before. This wasn't a seasonal raiding party that would return home before winter. It was a colonizing force that intended to stay, to conquer territory, and to establish permanent Scandinavian rule in England, led by legendary figures whose names still echo through history. This army moved through England like a force of nature. They captured York, one of England's most important cities, and established it as the capital of a new Viking kingdom. They conquered East Anglia and Mercia, two of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon realms. They came within a sword's length of conquering Wessex, the last independent English kingdom. The resistance they encountered was fierce and determined. Alfred the Great of Wessex proved to be a worthy opponent, combining military skill with political acumen and an understanding of Viking tactics that came from careful observation. The battles between Alfred's forces and the Great Army were not just conflicts between different armies, but clashes between different ways of life, different concepts of kingship, and different visions of what England might become. But even as they fought, both sides were learning from each other. English armies began to adopt Viking tactics and weapons. Viking settlers began to adopt English laws and customs. The boundary between conqueror and conquered became increasingly blurred, especially in areas where Scandinavian settlement was heavy and prolonged. The legal and administrative systems that emerged in these mixed territories reflected this cultural blending. The Danelaw, the area of England under Scandinavian control, developed its own distinctive legal traditions that combined elements from both cultures. Land tenure, inheritance laws, and criminal justice all showed the influence of both English and Scandinavian practices. Trade flourished in these mixed communities. English merchants found new markets for their goods in Scandinavia and Viking settlements. Scandinavian traders brought exotic products from across the known world to English markets. The cities that grew up in the Danelaw became cosmopolitan centers, where multiple languages were spoken and multiple currencies accepted. Religious change accompanied these political and economic transformations. Christianity had been making slow progress in Scandinavia, even before the Viking Age began. But contact with Christian lands accelerated this process, while also creating new complications and contradictions. Some Vikings converted to Christianity for practical reasons. Baptism might be required for certain types of diplomatic or commercial relationships. Christian wives might insist on Christian ceremonies for their children. Christian partners in business ventures might prefer to deal with fellow believers, but conversion wasn't always complete or permanent. Many Vikings maintained dual religious loyalties, invoking Christ in some situations and Thor in others. Others converted temporarily for specific purposes, then returned to their ancestral beliefs when it became convenient. Still others created hybrid belief systems that combined elements from both traditions. The churches and monasteries that had initially been primary targets for Viking raids gradually became centers for cultural exchange. Monks who had survived raids sometimes became advisors to Viking leaders, helping them understand the administrative systems of Christian kingdoms. Christian slaves and captives brought knowledge of writing, mathematics, and other scholarly disciplines to Viking courts. This religious and cultural mixing produced new forms of art and literature. Carved stone monuments began to appear that combined Christian and pagan imagery. Poets began to compose verses that used the traditional alliterative style of Germanic poetry to tell Christian stories. Metalworkers created crosses decorated with traditional Scandinavian animal motifs. The changes weren't limited to the Vikings themselves. The societies they encountered were transformed as well. English law began to incorporate Scandinavian legal concepts. Irish art showed the influence of Viking decorative styles. Frankish military organization adapted to deal with Viking tactical innovations. By the middle of the 9th century, it was becoming clear that the Viking Age wasn't just a period of raiding and conquest. It was a time of cultural transformation that was reshaping the entire North Atlantic world. The people who had begun as seasonal raiders were becoming permanent residents, rulers and cultural innovators in lands their grandparents had never imagined visiting. But the story was far from over. Even as Vikings were establishing kingdoms in Ireland and England, other groups were pushing further west into waters that no European had ever sailed. the same restless energy that had driven them to raid Christian monasteries was now carrying them toward discoveries that would expand the known world and challenge everything medieval Europeans thought they understood about geography and navigation. The greatest adventures of the Viking Age still lay ahead. The Western Ocean called to them with a voice that grew stronger with each generation. While their kinsmen were carving out kingdoms in England and Ireland, other Vikings were drawn by something deeper than the promise of silver or the thrill of conquest. They were pulled by the ancient hunger that drives all explorers, the need to see what lies beyond the edge of the known world. Iceland was their first great discovery in the Western Seas, though discovery might not be the right word. Irish monks had already found this volcanic island, establishing small hermitages where they could worship in solitude among the geysers and glaciers. But the Vikings who arrived in the 9th century came not as visitors but as permanent settlers ready to build a new kind of society in this harsh and beautiful land. The settlement of Iceland began around 874, led by a Norwegian chieftain named Ingolfur Arnarson. The story goes that as his ship approached the unknown coast, he threw his high seat pillars overboard and vowed to settle wherever the gods caused them to wash ashore. The pillars came to rest in a bay surrounded by steaming springs, and there he built his hall. He called the place Reykjavik, the Bay of Smokes, a name it still bears today. But Ingolfur was just the beginning. Over the following decades, thousands of Vikings made the dangerous crossing to Iceland. They came for different reasons. Some were fleeing the consolidation of royal power in Norway, unwilling to bend the knee to King Harald Fairhair. Others were younger sons with no inheritance, seeking land where they could establish their own farms and households. Still others were simply drawn by the stories of a vast island where a man could live free from the obligations and restrictions of the old world. What they created in Iceland was unlike anything that had existed before in the Viking world. With no native population to conquer and no established kingdoms to overthrow, they had to build their society from nothing. The result was a remarkable experiment in self-governance that would influence political thought for centuries to come. The Althing, established around 930, was perhaps the world's first parliament. It met each summer at a dramatic lava field called Thingvellir, where representatives from across Iceland gathered to make laws, settle disputes, and conduct the business of their new nation. There was no king, no central authority that could impose its will by force. Instead, the Icelanders created a system based on law and consensus, where even the most powerful chieftains had to argue their cases before assemblies of free farmers. This political innovation was made possible by Iceland's unique circumstances, but it reflected something deeper in Viking culture. These were people who valued individual freedom and personal honor above almost everything else. They had always lived in societies where a man's worth was measured not by his birth but by his deeds. Iceland gave them the chance to create a society where those values could flourish, without the constraints imposed by kings and established hierarchies. The stories they told reflected this independence of spirit. The Icelandic sagas, composed in the centuries following settlement, are among the greatest literary achievements of the medieval world. Unlike the courtly romances popular elsewhere in Europe, these tales focused on ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. They celebrated not just heroic warriors, but clever farmers, strong-willed women, and complex characters who struggled with moral dilemmas that had no easy answers. The sagas also preserved the memory of the Viking expansion in remarkable detail. Through these stories, we can trace the voyages that carried Scandinavians across the North Atlantic and eventually to the shores of North America. They tell us not just where the Vikings went, but why they went, how they prepared for their journeys, and what they found when they arrived. Eric the Red appears in these stories as a man whose violent temper repeatedly got him into trouble. Exiled from Norway for killing, he settled in Iceland only to be outlawed again for more killings. Facing 3 years of exile, Eric decided to use the time to explore rumors of land to the west. He had heard stories from sailors who had been blown off course, tales of a vast coastline beyond the horizon. The land Eric found was harsh beyond imagination. Glaciers covered much of the interior, and even in summer, ice crowded the coasts. But Eric was a man who understood the power of presentation. When he returned to Iceland after his exile, he spoke of the green land he had discovered, emphasizing the fertile valleys and rich pastures that could be found along the protected fjords. The name Greenland was both truth and marketing. The land was green in places during the brief summer months when grass grew thick in the sheltered valleys. But Eric knew that settlers would be more likely to join him if they imagined a land of plenty rather than a realm of ice and stone. The strategy worked. When Eric returned to Greenland around 985, he brought with him a fleet of 25 ships carrying nearly 1,000 colonists. The Greenland settlement was a testament to Viking adaptability and determination. These were people who had already proven their ability to survive in harsh climates, but Greenland tested their skills to the limit. Summers were brief and cool. Winters were long and dark. The growing season was so short that grain crops were impossible, and settlers had to survive on what they could hunt, fish, and gather, supplemented by whatever they could import from Iceland and Norway. Yet they persevered, creating a society that would endure for nearly 5 centuries. They built churches and farms, raised cattle and sheep, and maintained trade connections that stretched back to Europe. Archaeological evidence shows that they lived well by medieval standards, with substantial stone and turf houses, fine clothing, and imported luxuries that demonstrated their prosperity. But Greenland was not the end of Viking exploration in the Western Ocean. Around the year 1000, Eric's son Leif made a discovery that would forever change our understanding of medieval geography. Following reports from a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who claimed to have sighted unknown lands even further west, Leif assembled a crew and set sail into the unknown. What Leif found was a coastline unlike anything in Scandinavian experience. Vast forests stretched to the water's edge, filled with trees larger than any that grew in Greenland or Iceland. Rivers ran clear and swift, teeming with salmon larger than any they had seen. The climate was mild enough that grass remained green through the winter, and wild grapes grew in such abundance that they named the land Vinland, the wine land. The archaeological evidence for Viking presence in North America was finally confirmed in the 1960s when Norwegian explorers Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad excavated a site at Lonsø Meadows in Newfoundland. The remains they uncovered matched the descriptions from the sagas in remarkable detail. Here were the foundations of Norse-style buildings, the remains of a smithy where bog iron had been worked, and artifacts that could only have come from European settlers. But the North American colonies never flourished as Iceland and Greenland had. The sagas tell us why. Unlike the empty lands they had settled before, North America was already home to indigenous peoples whom the Vikings called Skraelings. Initial contact was peaceful, even friendly. The Norse traded metal goods for furs and other local products. But tensions soon arose, perhaps over trade disputes, perhaps over competition for resources, perhaps simply from cultural misunderstandings. The Vikings found themselves outnumbered in a hostile environment, thousands of miles from any possible reinforcement. After a few years of intermittent warfare and uneasy peace, they abandoned their North American settlements and returned to Greenland. It would be another 5 centuries before Europeans would again establish permanent settlements on the North American continent. Yet the failure of Vinland should not overshadow the magnitude of what the Vikings had achieved. Using only their traditional ships and navigation techniques, they had crossed thousands of miles of open ocean to reach a continent that wouldn't appear on European maps for another 500 years. They had demonstrated that the Atlantic Ocean was not an impassable barrier, but a highway for those brave enough to follow it. While these Western expeditions were pushing the boundaries of the known world, other Vikings were exploring in entirely different directions. The rivers of Eastern Europe beckoned with their own promises of wealth and adventure. Here, the same ships that had carried raiders to English monasteries and settlers to Iceland could be dragged overland between river systems, opening up trade routes that connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and beyond. The Vikings who followed these eastern routes were different from their western cousins. They came not primarily as raiders or settlers, but as traders and mercenaries. They established themselves as an elite warrior class among the Slavic peoples of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. They founded cities that would become some of Europe's greatest trading centers: Novgorod, Kiev, and eventually, through their connections, they reached the magnificent city of Constantinople itself. These Eastern Vikings, who came to be known as the Rus, created a different kind of legacy. Instead of establishing independent kingdoms like their Western counterparts, they integrated themselves into the existing political structures of Eastern Europe, eventually becoming the founders of what would grow into the Russian Empire. Their story intertwined with that of the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and the complex web of peoples and cultures that connected Northern Europe to the Mediterranean and beyond. The wealth that flowed back to Scandinavia through these Eastern connections was staggering. Silver from Islamic lands, silks from Constantinople, amber from the Baltic shores, furs from the northern forests. All of these goods passed through Viking hands on their way to markets across the medieval world. The Vikings had become not just raiders and conquerors, but the master merchants of their age. This transformation from raiders to traders to rulers was happening everywhere the Vikings had established themselves. In Ireland, the descendants of 9th century raiders had become the founders of cities and the patrons of monasteries. In England, Viking kings were minting coins with Christian symbols and endowing churches. In Normandy, the grandsons of Norwegian pirates were becoming some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated political leaders. The cultural synthesis that resulted from this expansion was extraordinary. Scandinavian artistic styles influenced church decoration across the British Isles. Irish illuminated manuscripts showed the impact of Viking decorative motifs. English legal concepts merged with Scandinavian traditions to create new forms of governance. The result was not the replacement of one culture by another, but the creation of something entirely new. Language reflected these changes as well. Old Norse words entered English, Irish, and French vocabularies, while Scandinavian languages absorbed influences from the lands where Vikings had settled. The very words we use to discuss maritime activities, legal concepts, and even basic social relationships often trace their origins to this period of intensive cultural contact. But perhaps the most profound change was in how medieval Europeans understood their world. Before the Viking Age, Europe had been a collection of isolated kingdoms and regions connected by trade routes but culturally distinct. The Viking expansion created for the first time a truly North Atlantic civilization that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, from the Arctic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. This expanded world brought new challenges as well as new opportunities. The political structures that had worked in small kingdoms proved inadequate for governing territories that spanned continents. The religious system that had served agricultural communities struggled to address the needs of cosmopolitan trading centers. The social hierarchies that had been stable in traditional societies became fluid and contested in the dynamic world the Vikings had created. The response to these challenges would shape the next phase of the Viking Age, as the descendants of raiders and explorers grappled with the complexities of ruling the world they had conquered. By the late 10th century, the Viking world had grown beyond anything its founders could have imagined. What had begun as seasonal raids from scattered fjords had become a vast network of kingdoms, trading posts, and settlements that stretched across half the known world. But with this expansion came new challenges that would test the very foundations of Viking society. The problem was one of scale and complexity. The social structures that worked perfectly for a Norwegian valley of a few hundred farmers proved inadequate for governing the diverse populations of York or Dublin. The personal loyalties that bound warriors to their chieftains in traditional Scandinavian society became strained when those chieftains ruled over thousands of subjects who spoke different languages and followed different customs. Kings who had once been first among equals in small warrior bands now found themselves responsible for tax collection, legal administration, and diplomatic relations with powerful foreign rulers. They needed scribes who could write in Latin, advisors who understood Christian theology, and administrators who could manage complex urban economies. The skills that had made them successful raiders, courage, loyalty, and tactical brilliance, were no longer sufficient for the challenges they faced. The most successful Viking rulers were those who learned to adapt. They surrounded themselves with advisors from the societies they governed, adopting and modifying local administrative practices to suit their needs. They patronized churches and monasteries not just for political advantage, but because these institutions provided the educated personnel essential for running complex kingdoms. This adaptation was perhaps most visible in the realm of religion. Christianity was spreading rapidly through the Viking world, but it wasn't simply replacing the old Norse beliefs. Instead, a complex process of religious synthesis was taking place that reflected the broader cultural mixing of the age. The conversion of Viking rulers was often pragmatic rather than purely spiritual. Baptism opened doors to diplomatic relationships with Christian kingdoms and provided access to the administrative expertise of the church. But many Viking converts maintained elements of their ancestral beliefs, creating hybrid religious practices that borrowed from both traditions. Churches built in Viking territories during this period show fascinating architectural and decorative influences. Stone crosses carved with traditional Norse animal motifs stood beside altars decorated with Christian symbols. Saga poets began composing verses that used the ancient Germanic alliterative style to tell stories from the Bible. Even the names Vikings gave their children began to reflect this religious mixing, with traditional Norse names like Thor and Odin appearing alongside Christian names like Magnus and Olaf. The religious transformation wasn't uniform across the Viking world. Some regions converted rapidly and thoroughly, while others maintained their ancestral beliefs for centuries. Iceland, despite its close connections to Christian lands, remained largely pagan until the year 1000, when the Althing voted to accept Christianity as the official religion while allowing private worship of the old gods to continue. This religious diversity created its own tensions and opportunities. Christian Viking rulers found themselves dealing with pagan subjects, while pagan jarls had to navigate relationships with Christian neighbors. Some leaders used religious differences to justify expansion or resistance, while others found ways to bridge these gaps for political or economic advantage. The economic implications of these changes were profound. The wealth that had originally driven Viking expansion was increasingly channeled into new purposes. Instead of being distributed among warriors as rewards for successful raids, treasure was now invested in infrastructure, trade networks, and the symbols of royal power. Magnificent halls rose in Viking capitals, their walls decorated with tapestries that told stories of both mythological heroes and Christian saints. Royal workshops produced jewelry and weapons that combined traditional Scandinavian craftsmanship with techniques learned from conquered territories. Mints established in Viking cities began producing coins that proclaimed the legitimacy of Nordic rulers in languages their grandfathers couldn't read. The transformation was perhaps most dramatic in the realm of law and governance. Traditional Scandinavian society had been governed by assemblies of free men who gathered to hear disputes and make collective decisions. This system worked well in small communities where everyone knew everyone else and shared common values and experiences. But ruling multi-ethnic kingdoms required different approaches. Viking rulers began adopting and adapting the legal systems they found in conquered territories. creating hybrid codes that combined Germanic traditions with local practices. The result was a fascinating patchwork of legal systems that reflected the complex cultural mixing of the age. In England, the Danelaw developed its own distinctive legal traditions that combined elements from both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian law. Inheritance practices, land tenure, and criminal justice all showed influences from both cultures. Similar processes were taking place in Ireland, where Viking legal concepts merged with ancient Gaelic traditions, and in Normandy, where Scandinavian customs blended with Frankish law. These legal innovations had lasting consequences far beyond the Viking Age itself. Many of the legal concepts that emerged from this cultural mixing would eventually influence the development of common law systems that spread across the English-speaking world. The idea that law should be based on precedent and community consensus rather than simply the will of rulers owes much to the democratic traditions of the Viking assemblies. Trade networks that had initially been based on raiding and tribute evolved into sophisticated commercial systems that connected distant markets and diverse economies. Viking merchants became specialists in moving goods across cultural and political boundaries, developing the skills and knowledge needed to navigate complex webs of alliance and enmity. The silver that had once been looted from monasteries now flowed through established trade routes that connected Scandinavia to markets as distant as Central Asia and North Africa. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking Age Scandinavia was flooded with silver from Islamic lands, much of it in the form of coins that were melted down and fashioned into arm rings, jewelry, and other objects that served both decorative and monetary functions. This commercial success required new skills and new forms of social organization. Viking merchants needed to understand not just the winds and tides that governed sea travel, but the political and economic factors that affected distant markets. They had to learn to work with partners and competitors from different cultures, to navigate foreign legal systems, and to adapt their products and practices to local preferences and requirements. The ships that carried this trade were marvels of engineering that reflected centuries of accumulated experience and innovation. The classic longships that had terrorized European coasts were joined by broader, deeper vessels, designed specifically for cargo carrying. These merchant ships, called nars, could carry tons of goods across the open ocean while still maintaining the shallow draft that allowed access to rivers and coastal waters. Navigation techniques became increasingly sophisticated as well. Viking navigators developed methods for finding their way across thousands of miles of open ocean using observations of the sun, stars, wind patterns, and ocean currents. They learned to read the behavior of birds and the color of water to determine their proximity to land. They created detailed mental maps of coastlines and harbors that were passed down from generation to generation through oral tradition. The cultural exchange that accompanied this trade was as significant as the economic benefits. Ideas, technologies, and artistic styles spread along the same routes that carried silver and amber. Scandinavian craftsmen learned new techniques from foreign artisans, while Viking artistic motifs appeared in artifacts found across Europe and beyond. Poetry and storytelling traditions were particularly enriched by this cultural contact. The skalds, The professional poets of the Viking courts incorporated new themes and imagery into their verses, drawing inspiration from the exotic lands and peoples they encountered through trade and conquest. The result was a flowering of literary creativity that would eventually produce some of the greatest works of medieval literature. But this period of expansion and cultural synthesis was also creating new sources of tension and instability. The very success of Viking expansion was changing the balance of power in Europe, provoking responses from established kingdoms and empires that felt threatened by Nordic ambitions. The Frankish Empire, which had initially seemed helpless against Viking raids, began to develop more effective defensive strategies. Fortified bridges blocked access to major rivers. Standing armies were organized to respond quickly to Viking attacks. Most importantly, the Franks learned to use Viking tactics and even Viking mercenaries against other Viking forces. Similar adaptations were taking place across Europe. English kingdoms that had once been easy prey for Viking raids became formidable opponents as they adopted Nordic military innovations and developed new strategies for dealing with seaborne attacks. Irish kings began building their own fleets and using Viking-style tactics against their traditional enemies. The religious dimension of these conflicts added another layer of complexity. What had once been seen primarily as political and economic struggles increasingly took on the character of religious wars, with Christian rulers portraying their conflicts with pagan Vikings as holy crusades blessed by God. This religious rhetoric had practical consequences as well. Christian kingdoms found it easier to form alliances against common pagan enemies, while Viking rulers discovered that conversion to Christianity could provide access to new military and political partnerships. The result was a complex web of shifting alliances that crossed ethnic and cultural boundaries. The pressure of these external challenges was matched by internal tensions within the Viking world itself. The success of expansion had created new forms of inequality and competition that strained traditional social bonds. Successful raiders and traders accumulated wealth and power on a scale that dwarfed traditional chieftains, while ordinary farmers found themselves increasingly marginalized in societies that valued commercial success over agricultural productivity. The old Viking ideal of the free farmer warrior who could defend his own land and participate as an equal in community assemblies was becoming harder to maintain in a world dominated by professional armies and international trade networks. Military service required specialized training and expensive equipment that many could not afford. Political participation demanded knowledge of complex legal and diplomatic traditions that were foreign to traditional Scandinavian culture. These social tensions were particularly acute in the homeland kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, where traditional elites found themselves competing with newly wealthy merchants and successful raiders for influence and authority. The result was a series of civil wars and succession disputes that would dominate Scandinavian politics for generations. The resolution of these conflicts would require new forms of political organization that could accommodate the diverse interests and populations of the expanded Viking world. kings who had once ruled through personal charisma and the loyalty of warrior bands needed to create institutions that could govern complex societies with diverse populations, varied economic interests, and competing religious traditions. The most successful rulers were those who found ways to blend traditional Scandinavian values with new organizational structures borrowed from the societies they governed. They created courts that honored both Norse heroes and Christian saints, legal systems that protected both traditional privileges and new commercial relationships, and military organizations that combined the fierce individual courage of Viking warriors with the disciplined tactics of professional armies. This process of institutional innovation was neither smooth nor uniform. Different regions developed different solutions to similar problems, creating a patchwork of political systems that reflected local conditions and historical circumstances. Some Viking kingdoms evolved into centralized monarchies similar to other European states, while others maintained more decentralized structures that preserved elements of traditional Scandinavian democracy. The diversity of these political experiments was one of the great strengths of Viking civilization during this period. Unlike more rigid systems that imposed uniform solutions across all territories, the Viking world's flexibility allowed for constant innovation and adaptation. Successful practices could spread rapidly through trade and diplomatic networks, while failed experiments could be abandoned without bringing down entire political structures. But this flexibility also created its own vulnerabilities. The lack of unified command structures made it difficult to coordinate responses to major threats. The diversity of legal and political systems created opportunities for enemies to exploit divisions within the Viking world. Most critically, the rapid pace of change was creating generational tensions between those who remembered the old ways and those who had grown up in the new cosmopolitan world of international commerce and cultural synthesis. These tensions would come to a head in the 11th century, as the Viking world faced its greatest challenges yet. New powers were rising in Europe that would test every innovation and adaptation the Vikings had developed. The age of easy conquest was ending, and the descendants of raiders would need to prove that they could not only win kingdoms but keep them against increasingly sophisticated enemies. The stage was being set for the final, most dramatic chapter of the Viking Age, when everything that had been built over 3 centuries of expansion would be put to the ultimate test. And so we reached the end of our journey through the Viking Age. A story that began with farmers gazing across familiar waters and ended with their descendants ruling kingdoms that stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. We've sailed with them through storm-tossed seas to unknown shores, stood beside them as they transformed from raiders into rulers, and watched as they wove themselves into the very fabric of medieval Europe. The Vikings were never just the horned helmet warriors of popular imagination. They were explorers who reached America 5 centuries before Columbus, traders who connected worlds that had never spoken to each other, poets who captured the human experience in verses that still move us today, and innovators who created new forms of government, art, and culture wherever they settled. Their legacy lives on in ways both obvious and hidden. In the English words we speak, many borrowed from Old Norse. in the legal traditions that value individual rights and democratic participation, in the spirit of exploration that drives us to seek new horizons, whether across oceans or among the stars. The Vikings taught medieval Europe that the world was larger than anyone had imagined, and that courage combined with skill could overcome any barrier. Perhaps most importantly, they showed us that cultures need not destroy each other to create something new and beautiful. The Viking Age was not just about conquest, but about synthesis, about finding ways for different peoples to live together and learn from each other while maintaining what made them unique. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that you carry within you the same restless spirit that drove those northern seafarers to push beyond the horizon. The same curiosity that led them to distant shores still burns in human hearts today. The Viking Age may have ended 1,000 years ago, but the age of exploration, discovery, and wonder continues with each new generation. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you on voyages as remarkable as any Viking ever dared to take.